およいよい
Hello, my name is Joshua Batts. I'm a research associate in the Faculty of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Cambridge. I've been there for a couple of years. I got my doctorate at Columbia in 2017 and then spent 2 years at the Shiryo Hensanjo at Tokyo University, or Todai, before coming to Cambridge in 2019. So that's a little bit about me in terms of my positions and the like. My reason for coming here today was to discuss a piece I'd written called Japan's Spanish Decade, Tokugawa and Spanish Outreach between 1598 and 1609. And it's a short piece that focuses primarily on letters exchanged between the Tokugawa shogunate and various actors in Spanish Manila. But the background behind it was to think about what Japan can contribute to global history, and specifically early modern Japan and what it can say about our history of encounter beyond the typical Christian century Christianity-driven encounter that I think most people who know anything about Japan in the 1500s and 1600s are familiar with. And so while I don't dispute or rebut any of that work, I'm interested in kind of telling the story that's alongside of or not completely dependent on the Christian century. So this piece that I presented today was one kind of short portion of a larger work that examines about 20 to 25 years of Tokugawa Japan's efforts to establish trans-Pacific trade with the Spanish Empire in the Americas. And that proceeded along three basic phases. The first one is an exchange of letters between the Tokugawa shogunate in Manila. The next one is you start to see an exchange of ships between Japan and Spanish America. And then the final one, maybe the best well-known, but not that well-known outside of the field, is the final embassy sent by Date Masamune that actually traveled all the way to Spain and Italy. So we kind of have phase 1 and 2 and 3. The paper today was just talking about the first phase, basically outreach via letters and conducted primarily between Japan and the Philippines. And the main contention here is that the Tokugawa shogunate and Japanese leadership were proactive in pursuing trade across the Pacific from early on, very early on, as soon as Hideyoshi had died in 1598. And so it's actually Japanese actors that are pushing for trans-Pacific commerce, and it's the European actors, the Spanish in this case, that are often quite cautious and not actually receptive. And I think that matters because we're used to hearing, if you think about the history of global encounters, we're used to hearing or seeing, reading about European expansion, European empire, where it's European ships come over the horizon, they drop anchor, they plant a flag, they discuss and negotiate and threaten and counter the locals in different ways, and it's always, an action and response, the arrival of Europeans and how people reacted to that. And even if recent scholarship has put a lot more agency, as it should be, on actors within East Asia, it's still the basic paradigm of European arrival, the reaction to it. So this case study is quite important, and it is kind of a minor, kind of a short, focused case study because it's an East Asian polity. The Japanese, in this case, are the ones that are actually pursuing the trans-Pacific or transoceanic trade. And it's the European imperial actors that are backing away from it. So this concept of the Spanish decade, right, that suggests a pretty beginning, a middle, and an end. So what caused the end? Ultimately, why didn't this work out? And the period I focus on here is about, in the paper, is about 10 years, but the entire period of outreach is closer to 20 or 25. And what I contend is that the attempt at a relationship, it failed, which is why most people haven't heard about it or thought about it in too much depth. But then the question, of course, becomes why? And to address the question of why this didn't work out, I consider and employ the use of frictions, multiple kinds of frictions. Specifically, I identify three. First one is geographical friction. And that is simply recognizing that it is quite difficult. It is a major investment to establish and maintain regular trans-Pacific commerce 400 years ago. Not a lot of people were doing it. People were sailing occasionally. The Spanish Empire was the only one doing it regularly. And so it's not a casual thing to send a ship over the horizon to the Americas or send a ship over the horizon from the Americas to Asia. And so you need to be willing to make a sustained investment in that effort for it to work out. And we should be properly appreciative of that. It is not natural or expected that everybody would be traversing these oceans easily, especially 400 years ago. So there's the issue of geographical frictions. Second one, and related, is economic frictions. And the short way to put this is that both the Spanish Americas and Japan were the major silver exporters at the time. So the question becomes, what do the world's two major silver exporters have to trade with one another? And the answer is they had a few things, but they didn't have a staple commodity immediately readily available. It wasn't obvious what could anchor a trade between these two continents, especially since silver wasn't on the agenda. And that, of course, feeds back into the geographic friction. If there's not a ready, easily identifiable thing to trade, then how long are you going to keep making the investment to send a ship that far over? So you have geographic friction, you have economic friction, and the last one I'll call correspondence frictions. And that's just trying to figure out who you should be talking to and who you correspond to. So I use correspondence in two ways: who you correspond with, in terms of actor A and actor B on either side, who should be doing the writing of these letters in contact, and who you correspond to in terms of your level or hierarchy within your kind of domestic and thus foreign political structures. And the short version there is that it was quite hard to establish correspondence in a proper way, in a way that could easily kind of sustain these relations. I contend that the Tokugawa shogunate was a little bit more flexible about this. They were just drafting letters to whoever would be able to kind of facilitate the trade. But that on balance, the Spanish wanted to move the request to open up an ocean, which is a big request. They wanted to move it up the chain of command. So to put it in kind of a short version, if you wanted to reroute the commerce of the Pacific, it was going to require direct correspondence between the shogun and the king. And if that's the bar you have to reach, that's quite a high bar. And if you add on top of that the fact that the main commodities being traded over long distances from both of these places was silver, that also makes it an even higher bar. And then if you add on that the general difficulty of sustaining and sending ships across an ocean 400 years ago, you can see that the bar you have to meet to sustain a relationship between the two is quite high indeed, and didn't work out. So the main point there is that it didn't work out not because the Japanese were insular and the Spanish were open, or because the Spanish were insular and the Japanese were open. It didn't work out because what was required to actually sustain a regular relationship across the Pacific 400 years ago was just simply too much for most societies to kind of willingly bear at those distances and at that cost. And I think that in turn, finally, to get to kind of what are the larger stakes here, suggests that even in a world that we usually recognize as globalizing or having more intensified contact, that there were still significant sources of friction that could undermine or impede that contact, even in an early modern world. And that's kind of the larger questions that my research ties into. So the impetus for my talk here today, or for me being here, was I had the opportunity and the privilege to present a pre-circulated paper with the group here, and was able to get an hour and a half of focused feedback. And the forum was great for doing so, and to be able to have that chance and that opportunity. So I've learned a couple of things. I kind of pitched this as a piece of writing, and having everyone's kind of sharp minds here attuned to that, we were able to talk about what kind of edits or revisions might needed to be carried out to kind of make what at the moment is a potential article into something that was draftable and submittable. And the specifics of those revisions are probably not camera-worthy, but I think they fed into discussions that are very important for anyone working on history, be it Japanese history alike, which is framing. How do you frame it? And if you set the bar for yourself to not just be Japanese history, but Japanese history kind of going global, or having a ready conversation with other fields, the issue of how you frame that work becomes, I think, paramount. So for me, I'm an early modern historian. Most of the people today were modernists, and that was actually quite helpful because our frameworks are a little bit different. So in terms of how you're pitching your work to others, having people to work on different time periods and having their impressions of the early modern period come in is quite helpful for understanding where your work can have impact. So, for example, I call this the Spanish Decade, and the paper I called it the Spanish Decade, and I think that works. But there was a comment given that I should actually think about this in terms of reframing and decentering Japan's relationship with the Dutch, which is kind of what I had implicitly been doing by emphasizing the Spanish, but I hadn't actually talked about the Dutch too much. But I think bringing in the idea that the Dutch-Japanese relationship is not the only relationship we need to care about, that it wasn't preordained, that the Japanese, to put it bluntly, weren't just sitting around waiting for the Dutch to arrive so they could have a lasting contact with the European community, that they were actually proactively trying different things. That was quite helpful for kind of thinking about how you can frame your work for larger audiences. And then I think there's a larger and related conversation about responsibility. Responsibility to other scholars in other fields and what it looks like when you enter into a conversation. So for myself, I'm trained as a Japanese historian. I'm not a historian of New Spain, say, or the Spanish Empire. And so there was a nice give and take about kind of if you open the door to other fields, how much are you then responsible? What does responsible scholarship look like when you're entering into conversation with fields and specialists beyond your immediate training? And I think if we're going to be kind of re-examining in depth what it means to do global history in the 21st century, that conversation is going to be ongoing and paramount, but also one that should be approached with a nice dose of humility and a willingness to learn as well. So that's not a question that gets decided in one roundtable, but I can say that having everybody's opinions and insights offered helped me personally at least think about what the responsibilities of my project will be going forward, and I found it extremely helpful. For that, I thank everybody that showed up today. There always, when you do conversations like this, there's a question of what the trajectory of your work is going to be, or what your next project is going to be. So this current paper is part of the manuscript project that's looking at kind of Japan and Spain relations over these 20 years. And today's paper was just a piece. But going forward beyond that, I think my next kind of larger series of projects is going to be looking at Japanese mining and minting at around the same time, late 16th and early 17th century. There's obviously some residual connection to the current work I'm doing because Japan existed in the minds of European communities at this time as a place where silver could be had, right? A lot of the early maps kind of label where they think the mines are in Japan. And for me, it's less about kind of reproducing a second book on Japanese-Spanish relations, but more continuing the idea of blending, actually I should say, taking the field into different directions. If the first project was really trying to reach out from Japanese history into global histories of encounter, this next project on mines and minting is going to be looking to try to pick at the wall a little bit between being a historian of Japan's foreign relations and being a historian of Japan's domestic or internal relations. Because often there is a bit of a gap there in terms of where your specialties are. But something like mining, right, it obviously circulates around the world, but is produced in a domestic context. And so my hope with the project of examining how mines were discovered, how labor was mobilized, and how the resources of mines were managed in the late 16th and 17th century during a period of obviously massive political consolidation and extensive and intensive foreign entanglements, I think is a useful way to get at that idea of not just having a history of Japan's foreign relations or a history of Japan's domestic governance, but a history of both, looking through the lens of that material. So this is all very early days, but I'm thinking at the moment of looking into work on managing that resource. So the Tokugawa come into power, they're making claims to some sort of archipelago-wide unity, and they claim the resources of Japan's mines for itself. And I've noticed that whenever I look at, especially in English language textbooks, it's just a sentence. Tokugawa came to power, he won in Sekigahara, he asserted control of the mines, and then they move on to foreign relations. So really the impetus for this work is what happens if we take that sentence seriously as the basis for an article or perhaps even a future monograph. So I think there's some fun stuff to be said about how you impose management, both human and mineral resources at this time. And in some early proddings, and for people that know the period, one of the earliest managers of the mines, Okubo Nagayasu, was involved in a huge corruption case. So I actually think the first project on Japan's mining might actually be a case in early Tokugawa corruption, which I think is a fun and interesting topic. So we're going to go from trade and encounter with the Spanish to kind of encountering corruption and graft domestically. And in my head, those two actually form a trajectory of sorts. Hopefully for the people reading the work, it will make sense to them too. Thanks.